talk about the book. I told you I got a chance to look at it.
Yeah.
You know, the spirits with scalpels.
Spirits with
It's
scalpels.
really an interesting subject, but you got this other subject going too.
Yeah.
And it seems a far, far better place now that
Yeah, we can
you're
hold
back
that
in
for
town.
another show.
Well, whatever. Welcome very, very much to Conversations, where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program and a friend of Conversations and of the world, I would say. And that's Dr. Sidney Greenfield, Emeritus Professor from the University of Wisconsin, and also the author of a book that I can show right now. We're going to be talking to about that book, and I'll hold it up until you get back on it. It's called Spirits with Scalpels, subtitled
The Cultural Biology of Religious Healing in Brazil.
Okay, the cultural biology of religious healing in Brazil. It's a huge subject. I just had a chance to look at the chapter on paradigms and the significance of it, a sort of pattern. Really interesting. We're going to want to talk to that. And then I'm wondering if you have on the, Joshua, in the control room, if you have the page, the title page that gives the title of an abstract paper that Dr. Greenfield's working on. Could you put that up, if you can find it there? Or maybe you could recite it. You sent me an abstract of a paper.
I don't remember the title.
Well, okay, I'm not sure if they're going to be able to find it. It would be on the title page. If you can, maybe they can bring. Anyway, it had to do with the idea of work. How the idea of putting stress upon the idea of human labor work is the problem in terms of solving the long-term problems of the economic order that we're all confronted with now, which is a subject I think it goes right to the core of the major problem confronting mankind and finding a way forward in a systems way with the economics and that. So that's all important. But Sidney, it's so good to see you. You've been moving around and everything, and talk to it. Let's wade in by talking about.
Hold the book.
Hold the book.
Hold the book.
Okay, you've been busy. You were down in Brazil and that sort of thing. But what's up with this abstract that you sent me of the paper you're working on?
Yeah, this is something that I have been working on, and we can set it in context because, you know, we're all living through this major economic crisis.
Indeed.
The economy seems to have fallen off a cliff, and you know, people are responding to it, and the administration right now is trying to fix it and to go back to where we were literally 2 years ago before it fell apart.
Yeah.
What I'd like to do, with your permission, is to try to put this in context.
Thank you. I think there's nothing more important.
This is something that we rarely do, and I want to take a broad overall view and indicate that the present problems, economic problems of our world, come out of the way the world was redefined and put in place anew after the Enlightenment.
Which Enlightenment?
The European Enlightenment.
European.
The European Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th century, primarily, out of which the United States became the exemplar of what a post-Enlightenment state would be. And the Enlightenment transformed the medieval world and created two major institutions for us. The political system of representative government, with governments having jurisdiction over territorial areas, states with boundaries, in which everybody was subjected to the laws implemented by the representative governments.
Right.
Okay?
As opposed to feudalism.
As opposed to the previous era where you had kingdoms, and the kingdoms spread out until there was another kingdom whose forces stopped you, and that's where the boundaries of Europe, of the nations of Europe, ended. The second institution is the market.
Right.
In the capitalist system. There were markets before and capitalism existed before, but the thinking of replacing human life based on religious authority that existed before and human reason supposedly through the Enlightenment replacing it instituted the pattern of markets as the primary means for producing and distributing goods and services.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, the date 1776 is the beginning of a revolution in the United States against Britain, and it also is the publication of the Wealth of Nations.
Wealth of Nations.
And also, I might indicate, the year that is given to the invention of the steam engine, which was one major factor of what was going to lead to what we call the Industrial Revolution.
The Industrial Revolution.
All in 1 year. It's amazing.
Okay.
Banner year.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, what I want to point out is these two new institutions, government and the market, have become focal points in the culture of modern nation states and the modern economy. And what has happened with the United States is that there are really a series of contradictions within American culture. And a major one is the vacillation between our focus on the market to do everything as opposed to representative government providing a constraint on the market, looking for some kind of system of democratic justice or distributive justice. So what happens is that at some periods we focus on the market, and what the market emphasizes and what is important is the notion of entrepreneurship, and what it goes back to is the Enlightenment idea that human worth, human morality depends upon what an individual could do by putting his efforts, called labor, into nature and combining it with nature as to what he can take out.
As opposed to perhaps kinship relationships or feudal fiefdoms and my liege lord.
As opposed to distributing what is produced, as you say, through bonds of kinship and other reciprocities that distribute goods. We emphasize this idea that an individual puts his efforts in against nature, and what he takes out is deservedly his.
Now, okay.
Nothing further.
Okay, that's all good. That's grounding is really good. I'd like to just say one thing about this enlightenment, because I know you're very in that. And there is a book that I recommend to people. It's a serious historian, and it happens to be titled How the Scots Invented the Modern World and Everything in It. It sounds capricious, but he makes a case for the fact that the major institutions by which we define modernism, which you're laying out, was more than anything else, it was a result of the Scottish Enlightenment more than French or European in general, and that Adam Smith, Hume, steam engine was invented, and that the institutions that constitute modern world, that maybe we're coming into a postmodern world and a transition from that 200, but it was 1776, and it was the Scots. A huge proportion of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Scots, and the major inventions, steam engine, democratic, the Wealth of Nations, came from Scotland. I just want to make the point so we'll know who to blame for the result of the institutions that are called modernism.
You know, the French and the English. But this is Western Europe that we're talking.
Yeah, but I just wanted to put it where we lay the blame. And it's them Scots in the kilts and whatnot. Because I'm part Scot, you see.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, no.
So I'm to blame. Or my people are to blame for this bloody mess we call modernism. But anyway.
Yeah, okay. But I think the important point is that this emphasis on entrepreneurship and the entrepreneur being the leader who is justifiable when he takes anything he can get. Now, the point to be made is that this Enlightenment notion of man in a state of nature never existed. It was an imagery that still shapes our thinking and our world. But there always have been others in the world,
Right.
not only the plants and the animals, but other human beings.
Right.
And you see, the United States became this Enlightenment nation
Mm-hmm.
in a land where lots of other people lived. We called them Indians.
Yeah, right.
And as a result, we had to get rid of the Indians.
And we did a good
And
job.
we did
of
a very good job of it.
And did the yeah.
But as instead of the Enlightenment ideal of progress that we always think of, even terms like modernity is a notion of advancement and progress.
Yeah.
The way,
August Comte.
the way the data seems to indicate, particularly for the United States, is that there's a pendulum effect.
Okay.
A pendulum effect in which at some points in history we focus and put everything into the market. When the market periodically collapses and lots of people get hurt as they are today, we move back to grab on to government and hope that the government can constrain the market to help all those who are hurt. And then when that happens, we move back in the other direction.
Right.
And both of them, remember, and this is important in the United States also, are replacing religion, where the church was the basis for our value system before, and we are dealing, and people still remember, I hope, the strength of the Christian right in the United States,
These last
who
8 years,
want us to go back and say, no, the rules of the Bible are what we want to live by, not human reason and this pendulum effect that's going on.
Yeah. And
Okay.
Teddy Roosevelt, Trustbuster, and yeah.
Right. So what happened was that with the support of the Christian right, with the belief coming primarily out of Protestantism, is this notion of merit and what people deserve in an authority situation in which the leadership of our society are the successful entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
These are the people we look up to, and people who don't make it, it's their own fault.
Right. That's built into a lot. Does it include the Puritan ethic?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Puritan
the
ethic?
Puritans are all part of this Protestant tradition that has been fomenting in the United States. After the Scopes trial, they were pushed into the background.
Right.
And in the 1970s and 80s, they came back with vehemence to provide a coalition with the conservatives to elect Ronald Reagan. And what this did was open the floodgates to Milton Friedman economics,
Chicago guys.
the Chicago guys, which focused on the notion of entrepreneurship as defining freedom as opposed to the absence of freedom under socialism. And what we wound up doing is going into a 3-decade period in which government was defined as bad, and any constraints government would put on the market and the entrepreneur was defined as bad. And as the pendulum swung, the American people said, yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
and they elected a whole series of people to government who said, okay, our job is to take all constraints off of government.
Right.
So all of the constraints, the regulations that were built in after the last Great Depression was systematically taken down and taken apart.
Yeah, it's a little kind of a jump. We kind of got over that thing with Mr. Roosevelt and Social Security. A lot of things were done, Securities and Exchange Commission, FDIC. There were a lot of things that were instituted in the wake of the Great Depression, which was another pendulum swing. But the point being is this dynamic between, let's say, corporate, profit, entrepreneurial, capital, and government ability to make laws, tax and spend, and regulate the overall order has been pendulum swinging back and forth. And 30 years it was Mr. Reagan came in, and then it became, and 40% of your support for Mr. Bush, George Bush, the most recent president, was from the religious right wing of fundamentalist Christianity,
Right.
and you have fundamentalism in a Christian sense, and that's been sort of the template in which the whole scenario played out. And then this came all unknown. There were some people who saw it coming, the current situation.
Hold just a second.
But
on
that's
that.
the sort of running history.
There's something that has to be added
Please.
to that,
Mhm.
because with the deregulation
Mhm.
that came along under the Reagan administration, the Clinton administration bought into it, and certainly the Bush administration.
But they were not able to third rail attack successfully Social Security.
Okay.
Many of those institutions still hold.
Hold
that's all.
Social Security aside for a
Mhm.
moment. What is significant for the present day crisis is the development of the financial markets.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
With the financial markets, which were something like 2% of GDP back in the 1960s, and this doubled and quadrupled in up to the present. But what the financial markets was essentially a gambling casino.
Well,
What it
okay.
enabled the bankers and the financial people and the hedge funds that developed were to make huge bets on things happening that began to expand. And remember, we had this tremendous expansion in wealth in the society, most of which was pushed by the financial markets. Now, into all of this, you have to add that during the same period, productivity, particularly industrial productivity, was moved out of the United States overseas to a series of other places, and the United States lived off of the financial markets. And we began to get what George Bush called the service economy, of everybody in the economy serving the wheelers and dealers, the entrepreneurs who were investing worldwide and accumulating money and growing bigger and bigger, buying up everything in sight. And they were buying everything in sight with borrowed money.
Okay,
With
that's
borrowed money that came from banks and loans that banks that made, like mortgages, were derivatized, with pieces of them taken and chopped up and made into securities that the investment people could use to borrow more money. And the borrowing increased, and what we had was this tremendous increase in consumption, that America became the major consumer society in history, with everybody borrowing to buy all of the new things, creating this world economy in which China grew, India grew, producing things for the American market.
That's all really very good.
All
That's
right,
a
wait
very
a second.
good. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Get it out.
Let me go on with it.
Yeah, there's
now,
a lot of.
During this period, wages stayed flat or dropped, even though productivity increased.
Okay.
In terms of the distribution, and what we came out with was the fact that the rich, the top 1%, were making out like bandits, making most of the wealth, and everybody else, wages were flat and everything was flat. But what was interesting in all of this, people consumed even more. Because they did it with borrowed money, credit cards, or for the middle class, borrowing
real estate bubble.
money on their homes. And we had what is called the housing bubble, which is that housing prices began to rise, so that somebody who bought a house for, say, $50,000 many years ago was sitting in it, and all of a sudden that house became worth $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, and they had this tremendous equity. So if they weren't making more money, they were able to take out second mortgages and borrow $50,000, $100,000 and use that for consumption.
Yeah, well, that was a longer-term trend that had been there, but it got accelerated. But the major way in which, because even from feudal days, you had a few people who owned the assets, and for the working people, if call it working people, or for the lower middle classes and so forth, the major way that anybody in that situation was able to, let's say, really raise their net worth was for a century, was the appreciation on the ownership of a residential. That was the major way in which they were able to get an increase in their net worth, was through the appreciated value of their residential property.
And then remember, we labeled the American dream as being able to own your own home. And lots of poor people, minorities came along complaining, why can't we share in the American dream? And even George Bush, as president, said, what we have to do is make home ownership available to more and more people. What was the outcome? Remember, wages are not rising. Everything is essentially inflating. What the banks decided to do, all the clever guys here, it was called subprime mortgages. You can buy a house. I know you don't have any money to buy a house. You don't even have a down payment. We will make arrangements to set up a mortgage for you, and you will pay it off out of borrowing. So if you buy a $100,000 house today, it's going to be worth $200,000 tomorrow. You'll borrow and you'll continue
paying off your loan. And that it held for a century. So people
did. It held for a period.
I can remember just as recently as 5 years ago saying, do you think there's, to economists who come on the show and everything, do you think there's a chance there is going to be a bursting of the housing bubble? And they say, of course not. It is just going up, and that's why they were able to do that. And that was the only way they had. The access to capital credit for industrial investment in the economy and so forth is so locked out of access to them. Their wages were constant. Productivity is usually measured in terms of labor productivity because we have this swoon to the labor theory of value and so forth. So this was all set up. But nobody thought there was going to be a bursting of the housing bubble.
There's another
and that was the main way in which people were able to get a sense of security within an ill-organized, based on inappropriate for what the future requires premises by our overall system.
But there's one other piece.
Okay. There's more than, but yes.
There's more. We have to put that in.
We got to get the derivatives.
The derivatives have to come in.
Swaps.
So what happened is that these subprime mortgages became part of packages, we call them derivatives, that banks put together, the financial markets put together, but these packages we used to borrow money again. This was called collateral, including the subprime mortgages. This became collateral for further borrowing, and the hedge fund managers and the financial managers borrowed it and used it to buy up corporations, buy up businesses, buy up newspapers, buy up banks to create things like Citigroup and Bank of America. This was all done, as they say, leveraged. It was based on borrowed money. So if you want to think of it as a Ponzi scheme, very comparable to the Madoff Ponzi scheme, what you saw was based on what banks were lending as mortgages, everything else was leveraged all the way up the system to billions and billions of dollars. Now, on top of this, what we then had...
Well, be careful.
Just a second.
All right, go ahead.
The rewards of the society then were going to those at the top, the entrepreneurs. Those people... wait, just a second. Just a second, Harold. Those people, in Schumpeter's terms, making new combinations. Some of the new combinations they made were the derivatives and insurance companies coming along and saying, hey, you're making a gamble of millions and billions of dollars here. We will provide you insurance in case it doesn't work. So companies like AIG set up special groups, and they provided insurance for all of these hedge fund operators and other people gambling on it. Now, if you
Well,
wait just a second.
Okay.
If you
There's more
work,
nuance.
if
but
you work
yeah.
on the assumption
Mhm.
that it's going to go up forever,
Mhm.
you're never going to have to pay off
Mhm.
the insurance. But what happened in all of this? And remember, these guys with their new things,
Yeah.
and what we were getting is physicists and mathematicians going
Yeah.
into Wall Street
Incredible
and figuring out all kinds of
algorithms,
new
yeah,
things
right.
that nobody understood,
Mhm.
all based on a banking system that at the very bottom they were lending money in mortgages to people who couldn't pay off.
Well, okay.
And what happened was that when poor people,
Mhm.
holders of subprime mortgages, couldn't pay their mortgages,
Mhm.
the banks started to reclaim the houses, but the mortgages were held as part of the derivatives,
Mhm.
and everybody started calling in their loans.
Mhm.
And when they started calling in their loans, the people who sold insurance on all of these loans were called in to pay. The system crumbled because the bottom pieces fell out, and as entrepreneurship is sometimes called, creative destruction
Yeah, that's true,
happened.
Peter. Yeah.
So the whole system fell over the cliff, and we turned to say, wow, the system fell apart, pendulum swings back. Oh, maybe the government should have been regulating all of this, and we sit now looking to the government when everybody forgets that, especially with devastation in the last 8 years, George Bush was elected to deregulate. So the SEC people he put in place did exactly what Bush was elected to do. They did not regulate. Nobody regulated. And we had, again, the passing of the Phil Graham and others
Yeah.
legislation to end Glass-Steagall
Yeah.
and let everybody...
When did that happen? That was
in
in
the
Reagan, yeah.
1990s.
Yeah,
And the point
yeah,
is,
yeah.
that was Robert
Yeah, to
Rubin,
yeah.
Clinton's Treasury
Mhm,
Secretary,
mhm,
and they all went along with this.
mhm.
And the really interesting point is that now that we are turning to government to help out,
Mhm.
what does President Obama do? He turns to Larry Summers.
Mhm.
He turns to
Geithner.
Geithner. He turns to all of the people who, under Clinton, deregulated all of this to hopefully think that they are going to come back. But what have they been doing? What they have been doing is moving from government to Wall Street,
Mhm.
to Goldman Sachs primarily, and who held a large chunk of the insurance claims on gambling in the casino economy of the financial sector, that they went to AIG and other insurance companies to get insurance on? Well, it was people like Goldman Sachs. So when we paid taxpayer dollars through the Treasury to AIG, they used that money to pay off what they had promised in these insurance contracts to Goldman Sachs, who are the biggest gamblers. So in effect, what we are now doing is paying off the entrepreneurs who came up with the new combinations for failing and subsidizing them with government funds. So what the government is doing right now is not re-regulating, not helping the public, but paying off the gambling debts of all of the hedge fund managers and others and people at Goldman Sachs.
And others.
So to keep them going, and what the administration seems to want to do is reconstitute what existed 2 years ago, which was all based on lending, and that's not going to get us out of the problem. That's going to prevent the movement back to using government and our elected officials in representative government to try to fix a problem we're going to try to go back to where we were and make it better, so that, to repeat the favorite mantra used today, so that the banks would start lending again. And they're hoping if the banks would start lending again, everybody will borrow, we'll get back into the rise and the bubbles in everything, and in the process we'll create jobs for people, continuing flat wages, but reconstitute the system of borrowing, so that if the fellow who is fired today, the woman who is fired today, will get a job, and even if she's not paid as much, she'll now have security to borrow money once the banks start lending and get back into the game, which is going to reconstitute the economy as it was at the height of the Bush era.
Full stop?
Full stop.
Okay, yeah.
And the question that
Yeah.
you and I are raising is, how in the world are they going to realize that this never would have fallen apart, the crisis never would have happened, if Kelso's thinking had been introduced half a century ago? You know why? Because very simply, the people who had subprime mortgages would have gotten a piece of all of this and had been able to make their mortgage payments. Had they made their mortgage payments, the whole system wouldn't have collapsed. So the question really becomes, as you and I think about it, is there any way, as a result of the crisis, that we're going to turn to government in the name of representative democracy and say, can we introduce into this a way for poor people to participate in the American dream and get a share in the ownership of all of these companies that were making out like bandits? And if they did, the system would continue growing, if you will, ever upward and onward.
Well, that would be,
And
say, go ahead. Yeah, full
Okay.
stop. I mean, it's
No, and
a
the point
interconnected thing.
the
yeah.
point that I want to make following this is, if you stop and look at the morality system of America apart from the economy, and the idea that people should have what they deserve, and what they deserve is based on their work in a system of competition, what it means is that there's very little way of us changing the economic system, because very simply, poor people don't deserve to have wealth in America.
Yeah.
They've
always been with us.
earn it.
Yeah, right.
And this is a competitive notion. And of course, we can step back for a moment when under government, when we tried very hard through welfare legislation to say the government should somehow redistribute some wealth so that poor people don't starve. Remember, what is very important in a market system, if you don't have a source of income, you don't eat. And people were not eating, so we tried very hard to patch something in so people would get food, like food stamps and other things. And the other
symptoms,
side
yeah.
came along and said, they don't deserve it. They're a bunch of welfare cheats. And Ronald Reagan used the famous case in his electoral campaign of the welfare cheats.
Yeah.
So we destroyed this idea of helping the poor, which the Kelso system will do once again. And the argument will come back, they don't deserve it. And what this means is, and I say this as an anthropologist thinking about the system, it is not until we take on this notion of a morality based on people working and earning, if you will, if I can go back to the beginning, taking from nature what their labor commands them to deserve. If we can't get a handle on that one,
that's a
think
biggie.
that through and say, this never was a reality. There was never a state of nature. humans never put their energy into taking out of nature what they deserved. And the other side of this is, by doing this, what we have permitted to happen is the destruction of the environment. Because what we took out of nature were all of the minerals with strip mining, all of the oil.
Henry George.
Right.
Yeah,
and
never
everything
took traction,
that we took out to change the balance of nature. Global warming follows from this. And the culprit in all of this is this system of production in which there are no limits.
Well, okay, you've talked a long time. Could I say something?
Please.
I mean, and it's all interconnected. That's good.
Yeah,
It's all
I'm trying
interconnected.
to connect the pieces.
I personally think AIG is being scapegoated, Madoff and so forth. I think they're being scapegoated by people who are part of a system that is got much larger problems than some bad players and so forth. I think it's a historical thing, and you laid it out. I don't know the when you talk about it, there's a big what's going on. You know, in terms of, we look at the whole evolution of, well, you could go to something like the whole evolution of consciousness or something like that. And what's going on is that and when you talk about we thought we had a growing value of real estate that was a source of net worth, was a way in which the folks could get some ownership in a society. The tax cut that they put through it all went to the upper 1/10 of 1% of the people, so it was trickled down, all of that. Those are symptoms, but it's a longer term thing, and it's that I think that the fact that they have the system is out of whack in a much larger way than is normally assumed, and the culprit is, philosophically or intellectually, is a thing called the labor theory of value, or putting labor, or putting the contribution of human beings to production, intellectual and physical, as relevant, and you're not going to distribute to the people according to need in some Marxian or socialist idea. You're not going to distribute to them in that way. You're going to distribute by their contribution to production. We have the Puritan ethic and a lot of other ethics wrapped up in the idea that the reason you're going to benefit materially is because of your effort, so that if you get an education, if you work hard, then you'll be able to get a better living standard, go to school, stay in school, learn what the teacher says, the work ethic. All of that is in an era where the actual source of the production is not tied directly to human input at all. It's tied into capital instruments that are increasingly responsible for production and owned by a minuscule percentage of people in all economies across the world and in the international order, and that is what's creating wealth, and there's been no way in which you can distribute income to the people by their ownership. A metaphor would be a combine moving across a Kansas field, creating hundreds of tons of wheat without even having a driver, but they would still try to get the distribution principle by the contribution of the labor input to production for the masses. That's the problem. That's the problem that confronts us. And the thing is, it's also, when you talk to great length. At the other end of that, when you talk about the means of production or productivity, use the word, that's usually tied to labor productivity and the economic models and so forth. But what you're measuring when you're measuring that bubble is what Bob Ashford, who we both know, would be unutilized productive capability. We have an unutilized productive capability that's not able to be realized within the system. And that unutilized capability, and I know people at AIG, Hank Greenberg, and the people who put that together, were operating within a system, within the private sector, since the system is not set up right. It's based on wrong principles. The whole economy, the whole world is set up on a system that is not in keeping with what the future requires, which has to do with the fact that the labor theory of value, which informs virtually all economic theory, from Adam Smith to Ricardo to Karl Marx to Marshall, to Keynes, to Schumpeter, to Van Hayek and Friedman and all of them. They're all essentially based on the idea that we're going to distribute income to the masses. There's got to be capital accumulation to get capital formation and growth. We're going to distribute income to the masses through a labor relationship that they have to the productive process, when in fact there is the source of production is all owned by a tiny group of people who are in that position. And we did not have a national economy formulated in keeping with the reality as it's evolving and what the future required. And because they didn't, people within the business of a globalizing world, you had large globalization taking place, communications developments, you're running into all kinds of things like currency fluctuations, all kind of externalities to the economic order, and they developed, and it only came in the last 20 years or so, seriously, but it's always been there, Lloyd's of London and so forth. Actually, it went back to Periclean Greece. They developed a system, swaps and derivatives, that tends to be lumped in as a evil thing or something, but they developed a system for dealing with risk in the economic order that exists. So if you're going to, and bankers would not even think about making a $100 million water project thing if they did, or suddenly a commodity trade or something, if they did not have insurance built in to the contract that they would make against unforeseen currency fluctuation, Mr. Soros and so forth. They would have to have that. So if you didn't have a derivatives clause in a contract on an international scale, you'd be sued for malpractice. There was nothing, the government, the world society is not set up right. The intellectuals have not come up with an answer to what the future requires. It's a huge Ponzi scheme. And don't blame the fellows who were going creative. Those derivatives
Nobody
and stocks were... No. Wait, let me talk. You talked for half an hour. So they did that. So I think they're Madoff, and there are others from the Republican side who will say Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. It's all a Ponzi scheme. It's not dealing with the question of how things, goods and services, are actually being produced in an altered way through time, which is the responsibility of intellectual leadership to talk about it. We had an enlightenment. We have not yet had a post-enlightenment enlightenment about what the future requires in terms of a vast, unutilized productive capability that we have technologically developed and scientifically developed. We have transcended. This is what it would say, and you'll never hear it said. But the reality is, against on a dialectic with that technological extension of consciousness on one quarter is on the destructive side, which leads the leading edge of research for one tribe to fight another tribe and steal their grain and grow and that sort of thing. Military, we now have, I think, I really want to get it straight. I would appreciate people getting in touch. But the weapon systems that have been existing, from the bow and arrow to the club to the Gatling gun to the dart, are now such that if there was to be a Guns of August, Barbara Tuchman movement of interrelating alliances between the various tribes of the world, outdated and all that, it's all outdated, hopelessly outdated, and so forth. That's where their alliances are, and all their spiritual tales and so forth like that. If it was mainly, apparently, from the modeling, it will mean now, since about the year 1970, that there would not be a single human being after 200,000 years of our evolution and so forth, existing after the release of the weapon systems that exist on the negative side. On the positive side, we have an equally significant, existentially relevant, unutilized capability. We can't utilize that, we can only model it. Unutilized capability, which brings us the capability that would render a result, a pattern that we have collectively as a human society now transcended material scarcity as a reality in terms of capability, not the reality, not the political reality. We have an unutilized capability that can take care of everybody and all the creatures in a way that has not been characteristic of any of the institutions by which we live, reify, and talk this political talk that's going on. And that lack of leadership is not the fault of the political leadership. It's not the fault of the banking leadership or the business leadership. It's the fault of the intellectual leadership to deal with that fact that there's a qualitative paradigm shifts going on. We have transcended material scarcity, totally undercut. We can take care of everybody. We can take care of all of the ecology. We can take care of everything in a way that simply have not been able to do out of the past. And so we do not have a system, a whole system, that relates to what the world, the future requires, and it's the fault of intellectuals who have not presented it. There is not the vision of that transformation at a design level and a system that would affect the design of the financial and political system that has a liberated humanity in the understanding that we have a sufficiency and a system that does it. It would incorporate a lot of the reinsuring of risk. You have to deal with the element of risk within the economic order, but we're hung up and not looking at the big picture that is there. And so that's the only caveat I have. We have something, and it would be the only thing that maybe stands out of the paradigm, the labor theory of value, all your Marxists and that kind of thing.
May I make a comment?
No, not quite. Almost done. And Marxists and all that. There's distribution according to need. And so you're going to distribute according to production. You've got to relate the people to the way things are being produced. And so you get an ownership stake in the capital equipment that's creating the wealth so that people have a source of income that is, and also the potential for growth in creating that capability. And it would liberate the people from the wage slavery. The humanity of the world are like serfs on a feudal estate picking up the leaves. The template is all set by a few people who own that, and they're tied up in assumptions and passing on assumptions that are out of date with what the future requires. We need vision. And the intellectuals are falling down on the job because they're all caught up within tenured positions that have been set by the leaders of the society who don't want to hear anything that doesn't fit in to their specialized paradigms and understandings of things. We don't have comprehensive visionary design leadership that we have addressed the principle. The main one is we have transcended scarcity at the level of capability. That's an entire, it throws every institution into the cocked hat. Every institution that we've set, our political systems, our institutions, our notions of human nature, everything is thrown into a cocked hat under that. But that is the reality that's emerging. And it's a lack of the intellectuals. They're all bought and paid for at universities and centers. Everything is set for in terms of an old paradigm that's outdated. That's the major problem. We need vision.
Can I get 2 cents in?
One last thing is it may be at the economic order, this thing that Lewis has said he would be the only thing that I can see that stands outside of the labor theory of value. You see, because you're going to say, well, you really should have a living wage. You are really important. You're really good. You're really and it's the song and dance that's got us all caught up on the conundrum that we're caught up with. Yeah, by all means.
Okay.
We got 10 minutes to go.
What you have done, and I thank you for it, and I mean this in the best of senses, you have presented what can be described as an Enlightenment intellectual's analysis of the situation, of which one side of me says, go, Harold, I agree with you fully. Mm-hmm. The other side of me, that is the anthropologist, says, yes, but Enlightenment intellectuals want to do what, for example, the people up at SIPA, the School of International Studies at Columbia, want to do is set out policies that they can tell government leaders, go out and do this because it's the right thing. The world doesn't work that way.
Well, okay.
Wait a second. The anthropologist in me comes and says, but wait a second. People behave because they believe things. If somebody comes along and tells them something that solves all their problems, they operate. They make decisions in terms of what they believe.
Of course.
And what they believe, as I
is
said
really important.
before, is that somebody is worth
Yes.
what they earn at work.
I know that. Not
Okay,
only
now
that.
wait a
Not
second,
only that.
Wait a second.
Not
wait
only
a
that.
second. Wait a second.
Yeah.
But the real culprit, if I go back to what you started with, the real culprit is a value that we hold in America that we've extended around the world.
Yeah,
is
we
the
call it-
value. Wait a second. The value of more. We are insatiable.
I'm for more.
When it comes.
I am.
Wait a
I am
second.
for more. I want more, 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 more. Growth, growth, growth.
That's right. But
Justice.
What does that mean?
Uh-huh.
That growth comes out of the system of markets, because if you look
I
at
want
history,
markets.
unfettered markets
No,
lead
not
to growth.
unfettered. No.
Unfettered markets lead to growth. Government intervention says, slow down, we have to think of distribution. You're talking
Well,
about
you set up a-
distribution.
yeah.
No, you're talking about inventing something
Yes.
that's not there.
No, right.
No.
It's been proposed.
It's
L-
been proposed.
What you need
Good.
is...
You and I.
Yeah, we
Harold,
understand
you
what
and
you need.
I,
I'll
if
tell you
we-
where it's
wait
all
a second.
going. We
Whoa,
only got a
whoa,
few
whoa,
minutes.
whoa.
We got to get
Okay,
this good word into the
If we
folks.
were controlling the world, we would remake it the way we agree it should be remade.
It's a
Wait a
qu-
second. Wait, give me just a minute
It's
more.
before us.
Just a second. We would remake the world as you are talking. The world operates, and people do their thing because they believe things like the worth and value of work.
They only
like
let-
the desire for more, like a whole series
nothing-
of other values
Uh-huh.
that are contradictory and incompatible.
Well-
and then if you want to seriously think about changing that world, you have to begin to think like an applied anthropologist and say, what are the values and beliefs that people hold and share
All right.
that have to be changed?
all well and good.
That is another thing
Applied
that,
anthrop-
just to finish this,
Finish
that
quick. We only
can
got-
be reduced back to a vision and policy organized and based on a new vision of the world.
Yes, it's called
And
liberation.
The new, no, it's not liberation.
Well, to me it is.
You call it
No,
what you
we're
like.
coming to the end of 200,000 years of human experience.
No,
we have
we're
quality.
not.
I just did a
We're
thing
only
with
300 years into the Enlightenment.
I'm not. I'm talking 200,000 years.
We've
been on
destroyed
this planet.
everything else.
We're coming to the point when you get the point where you can have a destruction of the entire species, which is the case. We finally reached a point. We have. Did you hear me when I said we have
Animals,
Did you hear me when we have transcended material scarcity?
You
No, we have
want-
material.
Excuse
No, that
me,
is at
you
the design
want
level.
Rationality.
No, not a
and Of
rationality.
course, what you are saying
With all
is
due respect-
rational human beings would not lead to their own destruction.
How
Look
are we
at what
gonna
is
say-
going on in
Do you
around
think
the
we're gonna
world
join
with
entropy?
people killing themselves
I know. Yeah, I know.
because of their beliefs.
Because, well,
they
look.
don't behave rationally. They behave
Okay.
culturally.
We only let
So let's think
Galileo
about
off the
that.
hook about 20 years ago for telling us we weren't geocentric. It takes a while for people to catch up. The biggest problem in all of that, the biggest problem is not with the liberals or with anything of that sort. The biggest problem is if you have a situation where there is sufficiency and you have a situation that's unutilized capability that we have, we need a system that can have growth. And by growth, we mean also growth being where the woman doesn't have to let the baby die because there's not enough food. I mean growth in that sense of justice as well as
You
growth.
need
Let me
a
finish.
new
You
system of
talk.
justice.
Yes, of course, it has to be that. But
Find it for me.
Let me tell you. Well, we've got that.
Give me a new religious
well,
belief system.
Well, you're going to. First of all, you're going to have a capital diffusion reinsurance corporation within the federal system that is going to be reassuring the casualty list against loss or against. It's going to be casual. It's Lewis Kelso's thing. It's incorrect. But most
You're
important,
reinsuring the bankers.
yes, you want the bankers.
The
There are
bankers-
no enemies. There are no enemies. There's no enemy in this except ignorance. You're going to need the private sector. You're going to need the people to. And then the biggest problem of all is that you're going to have to have a design capability that is so comprehensive. Anthropology is too narrow. You're going to have a comprehensive, fuller. You begin to get some vision. You get a comprehensive understanding of the whole evolution of consciousness itself as an anti-entropic force in the universe moving across entropy to bring increased conscious pattern of understanding to the process of which we're a part. And the hardest problem is the people who think they got the solution. You're going to have one that's so comprehensively appropriate. It's not going to be liberating of the poor suffering masses, serfs over all of human history. It's going to also be able to be understood by and gone along with those responsible for the historically institutions, outdated now, but anchoring us to history, who have been responsible for it. So there are no enemies. The AIG let Madoff out of jail. There are no enemies except the ignorance of which we've been living, and it's the responsibility of the intellectual to provide that vision, and they're falling down on the job. It's the intellectuals. They're all bought and paid for.
With just a word. And if my spirit will come back in 1,000 years or 10,000 years.
Let's hope there's people here 1,000 years to come back to.
You will not have what you are talking about, because it will not happen until you recognize that people behave in terms of their belief system.
Of course.
Nobody is going to paint
and we have to include them.
And
they have to be included.
Excuse me. If you believe that there's
including
going to
be
an evolution outside of human behavior that's going to bring us the progress of the Enlightenment.
It's called punctuated equilibrium. It's called punctuated equilibrium.
You give me whatever name you want, and I'm telling you, Harold, I agree with you fully, but it's not going to happen.
Okay,
and
but
what I'm trying to
what
do
is going to happen?
Off.
Do you think we're going to blow it up, Steve? Do you think we're going to get Israel a bunch of bombs? We're going to
destroy it? There's a very good chance we'll blow it up.
Isn't it sort of absurd? Now, we couldn't do it in the Second World War, Sid.
We didn't have the technology.
Something's happened, Sid.
We've got
There's been a change, Sid.
Yes,
it's been a change, a major change. No,
we can blow ourselves up.
That should be modeled. Now, what's the opposite side? What's the reality unrealized on the opposite side against which the paradigm is built? That's the question. It's a design question.
It's not a design question. The world doesn't operate in terms of designs. No, you want to go back to the Christian right and give us a designer in God?
No.
Bring us back to God. And God will do what you're proposing.
No, not
I
at all.
love it.
No.
I would vote for that God. But that's not
It's not God. No, it will include that. But the biggest thing is you're going to have in the loop of the so-called it's the progressives that are in the way. They're going to have to. They're all caught up in the dialectic. They're to blame.
You say you're not blaming anyone.
Yeah, you're not.
No,
you're not.
You are blaming
the bankers.
Someone.
The bankers are part of the same thing that we're in, and you've got to include them and the plutocrats in the pattern and their own understanding to anchor it to history, and then we will get to a systems understanding of the whole thing. But it's got to include everybody in the orchestra.
Do you really believe?
Yes.
The
it's
brightest
idealistic.
and the smartest who go into investment banking when we get it back on the track
are
really going to care about anybody else but themselves.
Yes, I do.
In our highly
yes, I do. And you have to present
society.
something to them they can understand. There's a sense of responsibility there, and you have to respect. We have to get everybody in on it. That's what we need. That's exactly past the dialectic. Of which all the politics. It is.
It's
the politics of all the marches.
And the point is neither Adam Smith nor Karl Marx, and using his terminology, are going to get us out of this. You're right.
Lewis Kelser has a chance, and Bucky Fuller and anticipatory design science.
It requires a new vision.
Yes, that's what I'm calling for. Where the hell are they? Where are they? They're all talking in the same old dialectic. Bad guy, good guy, bad guy, good. Things have changed.
Watch the way people behave, and our government's going to behave. And let's sit down in a year or 2 years and see what happens, whether it goes the way you're suggesting
I'm very encouraged.
Or the way I
They're going to have to establish a new institution in the federal structure. Capital diffusion. Diffusion. You're going to have to get income to people by their ownership of capital instruments in order to free them up to be free to realize their unfettered real intellectual autodidactic interest.
If we were Greek gods sitting above, capable of manipulating all of this, we would be able to move ahead and do what you're saying.
I don't think we have any choice.
The world doesn't work
well,
that way.
Perhaps so, but I think the world...
I would like to go back and say, keep the design in mind, but talk about how one can change things like the value of work and human beings as we know them.
That's one small step of it.
Creating their identity.
Yeah, of course,
their
and
whole
then he's all
humanity in
you
terms
begin to
of,
understand the
and
importance
get
of them.
them to listen, because that's